Well, I'm joined now by our panel, former Auckland mayoral candidate Efeso Collins and former National Party Deputy Leader Paula Bennett. Welcome to you both. I want to touch on that interview that we've just seen. Were you surprised, Efeso, to see people still living in their ruined homes after a year after those floods?
Yeah, not necessarily surprised, because these are places that people have, been spending so much time. It's part of who they are. And I think if you look at what was happening in the responses, particularly in West Auckland and Māngere and Otara, what we saw was the community rallied around those people, and it was that negotiation that got people out of their homes. But there was major devastation. You can understand why people are slow to move. One of the things that she commented on was we've got to plan better. We've got to spend the money up front rather than be reactionary. And I think there's a lot of plans we have, but we don't have a lot of funding and a lot of kind of nous when it comes to being responsive immediately.
Paula, do you agree with Margaret that a voluntary element to managed retreat is necessary, or sometimes does the government have to get tough?
Yeah, a bit of both, really. So, I love the interview, and I think it's just something we really need to hear more about, because you can take the learnings from Christchurch and certainly how that did, and from Queensland as well. So if you look at that, I think that she was absolutely right, and that the Christchurch, we had to make some tough decisions and say to people, and often in our poorer areas, sorry, you're not going to be building here again. How do we do this? How do we move you? But at the other level, communities like Maimuruai, and when you look at those communities, they want to be part of the solution. And if you don't bring them with you, and if you don't communicate well, I can tell you my staunch Westies will stand up for themselves.
I do not doubt that. We've seen a little bit of that already. I want to move on to attendance now, because this is such a huge issue, isn't it? One of the most pressing issues probably for this government. What did you think of the Minister's interview, Paula?
I feel awful, because I actually think it was an awful interview, to be quite blunt with you.
Why?
And I don't want to sit here and rip into her, because I think she's a relatively new minister with a huge portfolio, and I want her to do well, because, gosh, we all want education and our kids to do well, and if she's good in the job, then that'll be it. Yes. But too much over-explaining when it comes to numbers. The moderate children, I just couldn't get past that. When she tried to correct you on, it's one term and not the whole year that there's 95,000 children, there were kind of so many different elements to it that it wasn't concise, and it just felt like this policy is really ill thought out.
Well, you've raised a really good point, which is that we need, and I think the Minister would agree with this, is we need better data, don't we, from the Ministry of Education. We need to know the size of the problem, Efeso, and we need to know exactly where it is in order to make good policy, don't we? Yeah,
the interview got stronger towards the end. I think she found her stride as she started to talk more about her experience as a school principal. I think where we can kind of work out what's the difference is she started to talk about engagement and attendance, and I think we've got to focus on disengagement. Young people are disengaged for all of the reasons that you've explained, but if our young people don't feel like they're welcome, they don't feel like they're valued in the schooling system, then they're going to disengage, and that's one of the reasons we're seeing that. It's not just about the COVID and the sick children. You explained that, and we can put those people to the side, but what we've got is a schooling system that isn't allowing our young people to be creative and collaborative. That's what we want our young people to leave the schooling system with. Instead, we almost expect docile learners who are just recipients of information. We've got to be more than that in a schooling system.
Do you agree, Paula? Because you would have come across in your time in the Ministry of Social Development very disengaged families. So how do you bring people back into the system?
Well, it doesn't sound like this policy is going to do anything for that. I mean, it feels like that this attendance, 82 people, are actually for the parents in St Heliers that are going to Fiji for a week in term time.
Right, so she is attacking this group, right? But this is where you get a good boost in the numbers. And
I kind of argue that those are not the children that we should be most concerned about at this time, and when we should be putting, we've got a Ministry of Education under the current Prime Minister, when he was Minister, 1,500 new staff, more staff in the ministry and head office, and we're saying 82 people throughout the country for attendance, when it's probably education-wise the most important thing that's going on there. If they're not there, they can't learn. We know all of that. Yes. So it feels like then when he was still the Minister of Education and thinking over Christmas he was going to become the Prime Minister, he sat there and went, where's my shortfalls? Oh, I better make sure we do something about education. And it feels ill thought out, really on the edge, and just isn't going to make the biggest difference for those most marginalised children that you mentioned.
Yeah, and they should be the focus, shouldn't they, Efeso? Should we just be putting that 75 million straight into those schools, which we know is the beating heart of those communities, and saying, you use your networks, you know these kids, you get to them.
Yeah, schools know their communities really well. They know the families that are disengaged, and I would be committing all of this resource to youth workers or social workers, because they're the ones who are going to work with families. I'm really troubled by the idea that the truancy officers or whatever they're called, may work with families. You have to work with families. The Pacific Education Plan says that the whānau was at the core of the learning experience. So we've got to be working alongside families and supporting them. I work with Otara Health, which is supporting youth who are disengaged. A lot of the young people that we're working with come from the RAM raiding families. If we don't work with the entire family, no one's getting support, and otherwise we're just going to recycle the same issue. We've got to look at the schooling system much wider, because that's what we want.
Well, this does, Paula.
Well, I was going to say, sometimes, excuse the language, but you just got to be bloody minded about getting them to school. You know, like I agree with you 100%. Please don't get me wrong, because I understand as much as anyone that it is all a whānau and that we've got to do it. But sometimes, you know, I met this amazing woman in Kawerau I was talking about, and she was a nan, and she said my job was to get those kids to school, and I would step over drunk dad, and I would pull the kid out of bed, and I would get them dressed, and then I'd make sure I had a feed for them in the van, and I'd get them to school. And within 3 days, they're actually waiting for me when I turn up. And then within a couple of weeks, they're actually walking there by themselves. Now, I'm saying drunk dad probably needs a whole lot of help, and there's a whole lot of other things going in that household. I don't deny it. Let's get that support. But sometimes, let's just get these kids to school where it's safe, they can learn, we can, you know, really give them that kind of support there as well.
Yeah, that is the pathway, isn't it? So what do you think, Efeso? Do you think that the Minister is being ambitious enough? We've got she wants to get 70% of kids going 90% of the time by next year. That still feels low. Yeah,
I'd like to see higher targets. And what should be happening is schools should be able to identify when a child hits 90% attendance, then some kind of alarm goes off and we get someone out working with the student. We shouldn't be getting to 70% and then alarm bells are raised publicly, because that seems to be the standard. So we can do more. You know, and there'll be educationalists watching this program now who will know that Freire, you know, the Brazilian philosopher, we talked about a schooling system that allows people to be liberated. And that liberation comes from having a trusted system. We've got to have good teacher-student relationships. That's what young people are going to feel engaged with. And we're going to need Nan, we're going to need Auntie to come in and just walk in and say, right, all the kids have to get ready, because parents need that support too. And sometimes it's the Nan story that makes a difference.
I want to switch now to Rob Campbell, because we have had a little bit of a soap opera and a mini drama playing out in Wellington this week. Rob Campbell was sacked from his two positions as chair. Paula, you are a former State Services Minister. What's your view?
I loved that job, by the way, because well, if you work on the public service and how they connect both together and then with communities and with places, then you're actually going to make a longer term difference than you can in doing one little policy as a minister. So I actually saw that as a huge privilege. I am the biggest advocate for a neutral public service, you know, and let me give you the alternative. The alternative is an American model, where the president comes in and elects his mates that have funded his campaign into senior roles, running huge ministries. And I have got so much respect for our public service. They are there, they are neutral, they can move from one government to another, so they can, you know, and I think that there is something absolutely in that gives us not a uniqueness, but something kind of special, that those experts can actually stay in their roles and work with any government of any colour.
But is it unreasonable for them to expect them not to have any opinion? They are probably better informed than most people who are free to have an opinion on politics or on policy. What do you think, Efeso?
Yeah, you definitely want the public service to give you free and frank advice. And I think this has opened up a huge discussion this week, the LinkedIn post that Rob put up. Look, I'm really supportive of people having the ability to have their say, but we've got to have it within the confines of being trusted both by the ministers that you're serving as well as the general public. And so for me, I'm still probably on the fence, to be honest, because I like the idea of people being able to be full and frank, but I think there are particular restrictions that we've got to place on ourselves. So I haven't really settled on a position this week, other than I can see that people want us to be really robust in the way in which we give advice, but this is tinkering on those edges a little bit.
Well, you know, Christopher Luxon is big enough, isn't he, to take a bit of a critique of his Three Waters policy. You know,
that's not the point.
No, but it shouldn't. So why shouldn't Rob Campbell be able to say what he thinks and still do his job at Te Whatu Ora well?
Because he's wading into politics, and that's not what he signed up for with the job. It then gives a perception, and you wonder
What's
if
the
we.
perception?
Well, the perception is if we have a national government in October 15th, can he work with them in a fair and professional way? And I'm whatever National said, I'm saying to you, I would question that.
Yeah.
Whereas I love the free and frank. So I can remember so many times Treasury coming out in disagreement with then Finance Minister Bill English, and Bill loved it. Like he'd go, yeah, they think, you know, like they presented this information, and some of the media would make this big thing that your Treasury and the Finance Minister are loggerheads. And it's like, well, actually they're debating policy. So debate policy, disagree, go for it. But actually, when you're in those bigger jobs, your political opinions should perhaps stay yourself.
Okay, never short of a political opinion between us all. Thank you so much for coming onto the panel this morning. Thanks, guys.
Kia ora.